All right, today is December the 11th in 2024, and my guest is Anders Sandberg. Anders is a Swedish researcher, futurist, and transhumanist. He holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from Stockholm University and is a former senior research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute and the University of Oxford. Today, we're going to talk about the governance of innovation and the innovation of governance. Welcome, Anders.
Thank you. This is exciting.
Yeah. To start off with, what is your favorite D&D character?
Among my own characters or the one in published supplements?
Up to you, right? What do you prefer actually? Do you prefer playing or DMing?
I prefer both, actually. I find it
Hmm.
very exciting both to be able to make that creative work and creating a world, explaining it to the players, see my players take it and make it theirs. But it's also very fun to be part of it. So, one of my favorite characters was just the utterly insanely sensible dwarf Brotor Trueanvil, who just always did the sensible thing up to the point of pure insanity. But on the other hand, of course, it's very hard to have a favorite when it comes to something creative because you always want to have your next character, your next non-player character that you want to describe. I have such a good villain in my current campaign, but I can't reveal too much because my players might be listening in. And then there is the interesting shared fiction, of course, that happens when an entire hobby, or sometimes reading supplements and having opinions about how do we interpret Strahd or Vecna or the other great villains, or for that manner, the Lord of the Cats, the most peculiar god in the Dungeons and Dragons pantheon.
Yeah, your answer sounds a bit like I'm actually playing D&D. I also really enjoy building new characters and storylines and interpreting existing supplements and things like that. Um,
And it's an interesting link, perhaps, to our topic,
mhm.
because a while ago I was chatting to a whole bunch of entrepreneurs over here in Sweden, and we realized that we're all role players. We all spent the 90s playing various Swedish role playing games like Drakar Demoner, Mutant, and the others. And then before joined the Swedish Role Playing and Conflict Association, and then some of them became entrepreneurs, organizers, and now some of them are running pretty big companies or small AI startups, etc. So there is this interesting aspect of a hobby that allows you to create your character, fitting very well with you can actually create your own institutions, you can create your own software worlds, and sometimes you can even sell them.
Yeah, I would also say, especially being a DM, is almost a bit like running a company, right? Because you want people to succeed in their different storylines where they are the personal hero, right? So
Yeah.
there's like someone who wants to find treasures, someone who wants to like fight monsters, someone who wants to solve riddles, and you want to make sure that everyone feels like they have like the hero, they have a hero's arc or story.
Yeah, in the theory of computer games and gaming in general, there are, of course, these elaborate theories about the different player types. And one of the classic design challenges when you make a computer game is you want to give something to most of the types. When you're playing with people that you interact with, you can, of course, tell that that player really wants the rewards and that player really wants to get in the spotlight from time to time to role play something funny. And that player just want to be with the other players, and of course, you can adapt to that. The problem is the scaling. So, the largest gaming group I ever ran, I think we were up to 15 people in the final session. That was way too much. But it
Yeah.
was also very much like a Baroque Restoration era comedy. So you had lots of people doing lots of weird and silly things, and essentially a chorus of people getting involved in the action. But many of the best games are much smaller, typically kind of three players. Some of the absolutely best game sessions have been with a single player and me as the game master. And the problem is, of course, when you try to run a company, this is not how it works. It would be wonderful if a manager could know everybody and know their motivations and figure out perfectly that Bill, he really just wants to have a high salary. But Jane, she really wants to explore things, and let's put them on the right projects to get the most of them. Or for that matter, a government. Imagine a government that actually got people to the right spots. of course, at this point, you also have this question, how much of this is the government running the game versus that we as players might actually say, we want to have a say in how this story goes.
Yeah. One lesson is also to keep teams small, which you also often need to do in a company, like pizza-sized teams. but yeah, another question. Curious, if you could make one, and let's talk about innovation and technology now. If you could make one innovation, and it can be technological or non-technology, work in your lifetime, but everything else stagnates, what would that be?
That's an interesting one. Of course, the cheating one would be to say life extension.
Life extension, yeah.
Because then it doesn't matter that it stagnates because eventually stuff gets done. Except that that's strictly speaking not true. Because, for example, when it comes to climate change, there is a clock ticking. And if we don't innovate various technologies related to that, we are going to have to pay a rather high price. So I think the actual technology I want, besides saying the standard kind of wish list, like wishing for peace on earth for Christmas, of course, I'm wishing for safe, aligned super intelligence. But what I actually think would be the really interesting technology would be a way of scaling intelligence in organizations to make organizations smarter. This is potentially dangerous. It's a little bit like wishing for super intelligent AI. But I think we actually need to find better ways of setting incentives and aligning organizations and actually having organizations be as smart as the sum of the brains that they contain. Right now, it's kind of astonishing that a state can have literally millions or hundreds of millions of citizens, yet that state is not millions of times smarter than an individual. Quite often, it's more dumb.
Exactly. That's a very good answer, because I was also thinking life extension kind of as a cheat, but on the other hand, life extension wouldn't make us immortal, right? So we'd still have like risks that could kill us, right? So even if biologically we're able to live forever or long, right? So I really like that introducing something else that could overcome stagnation in other areas, like intelligence, augmentation, or scaling, could be kind of the solution to that.
And once you have that, of course, you can start fixing the life extension part. But I do think there is something very interesting about that question. Why aren't groups much smarter? So we hear all the time about the wisdom of crowds, and the typical standard examples are all about problems that are very easy to either see that this is a solution once somebody proposes it, or where you can average together things. So these are the two cases where the wisdom of crowds really tends to stand out. But for complex problems, we don't have the same. Certainly, making a microchip requires an enormous organization, and no single person knows how to make a microchip. You want to have specialists to understand vacuum handling and metrology, and how to make molecular beam epitaxy and whatnot. And then you string them together. You need to have experts on management, etc. But the end result is certainly capable. It has a kind of throughput and a depth of knowledge, but it's still not solving very, very ingenious problems. As I think Nick Bostrom said, has anybody ever read a novel that was written by a comedian that was actually great? We don't see that. Sometimes we encounter films that can be argued that this is a great film and it was made by a team, but quite often you're one or two people who have a main vision and other people work to implement it. It's rare that we put together creativity and intelligence and knowledge in a way that actually makes it much more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, that's something we're definitely going to talk more about in this conversation, sort of decentralized intelligence or formation of innovation, and open systems versus closed systems. I'm curious, as a starting point, to talk about like the governance of innovation. And that's like, right, how do we deal with people with new ideas? And what are kind of the coordinations, mitigations of risk, or whatever required? Let's maybe start by, what is meta innovation?
So meta innovation is improving ways of doing innovation. And I think it's very easy today for us to assume that, huh? do you need that? Isn't it that you just go into the workshop and tinker a bit and come out with the light bulb? And the answer is, of course, no, that's actually not how it worked. Indeed, Edison was one of the great meta inventors. He's known as an inventor, but because it's easy to point to the light bulb. But what he actually did was setting up this innovation factory. He basically made sure they had a lab, he had a lot of assistants, and he put them on various tasks to solve various problems needed. You can also develop other forms of meta innovation. Patents, for example, are an interesting case. So here you create an incentive for not just coming up with new stuff, because now you get to make money from it, but you also create an incentive to spread the knowledge of how that new stuff is done. And this is not a trivial thing. So the modern patent was kind of invented in the early modern era in Europe. Although there is a hilarious precursor I just discovered in Athenaeus' book, The Dining Philosophers. So we're talking a Roman book about witty the dinner conversation repartee. And in the volume where he's talking about decadence and lavishness, and the Romans, of course, felt that we are not decadent at all, but those other guys are. He talked about Sybaris, this mostly fictionalized take on Sicilian kingdom, but back in the day was so much into luxuriousness that they actually had somebody invent a new dish. They got this patent for 1 year. They were only allowed to make that dish. And nobody else was allowed to make the dish, and that's how they made a lot of money, and that's how they incentivized the innovation of new dishes,
Hmm.
which is honestly a really nice precursor to a patent. It might not have helped Sybaris win the war against dour and boring and practical Croton, but that idea is a meta innovation. But it's very telling that it was a unique thing, because the ancient Greek and Romans, they didn't really believe very much in innovations, or rather, it was craft. It was not something gentlemen were doing. So certainly the craftspeople are doing stuff like that, but nobody cares about them. And that was, of course, one reason why we're speaking English right now rather than Latin language, and why we're not wearing togas and going to the stars already. Because the Greeks and Romans really never grasped how to make a good innovation infrastructure. They never created these meta innovations. They certainly innovated thinking. Philosophy is, in some sense, a form of meta thinking. You think about what you think and you can improve stuff. But they never cared too much about that practical stuff. What happened, of course, in the early modern era with the scientific revolution was that people started caring about coming up with new things that had never existed before. And eventually, the value of that started showing up, at which point you got the other big battle. You have guilds that generally tended to monopolize certain forms of knowledge and crafts. And breaking up the guilds was, in some sense, a meta innovation. And again, why did that happen? Well, part of it was politics. Part of it was also the nascent science of economics, actually showing that it's better for everybody if we actually spread the innovations widely. But in the early modern era, generally knowledge was regarded as better if it was secret. Telling everybody about your discovery, that's not really what proper gentleman scientists should be doing. So that shift from knowledge is sacred and holy and only for the select to knowledge should be free and knowledge is better when shared is a really dramatic shift that changes much of how things work. But of course, in the modern era, we're now trying to come up with better ways of doing innovation. Indeed, the term innovation system is a kind of boring approach to figuring out institutions and the laws and regulations that might help it. That is the politicians and administrators' take on it. But you might also have technologies for innovating. People have been suggesting schemes for rationally coming up with new innovations, like the TRIS system that was developed in Eastern Europe, where you systematically work through an array of possibilities to try to see, have we covered all the possibilities, and maybe some of them could be explored. Over to the idea of, could we use AI to automate the generation of innovations and maybe automatically patent them and then get profit?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I like the description of patents as an example for meta innovation. On the other hand, I also have a bit of a different reading of patents. I think they actually not working as driving innovation. Um,
Yep, that's the problem. Many of meta innovations can be really stifling too, or
yeah,
not
yeah,
work as advertised. So this, of course, goes for any innovation.
yeah,
Any
yeah, yeah,
technology can just fail, or it might not be fit for purpose, or it might have drawbacks that are very problematic. So the
exactly.
whole point of patents was stimulate innovation by giving people a certain period where we got a monopoly. So that means that you accept monopolies and you assume that you can make enough money during that time to offset the research the time and effort. The problem is, of course, in different domains, that time might be different. So pharmaceutical patents versus electronics patents or software patents might have a very different dynamics. And it's not entirely obvious how to adjust this because many domains also change in their nature as they progress.
Yeah.
Software is becoming ever more fast moving, and patents might be less important than just getting out first to market. But first to market usually means that you have a lot of bugs, which might be very bad because you can now scale up your innovation so it would use worldwide when it suddenly breaks.
Yeah, I think that's also a good example of where we can talk about the adaptation of institutions, right? So um, I don't agree, but even people who are generally don't buy the argument for patents say, okay, maybe in pharmaceutical it makes sense, and it probably does, definitely does make sense with current drug development costs. Because right now you need to spend like hundreds of millions to develop a new drug, and then you have like the small molecule, and then anyone else could replicate it. So obviously you need a monopoly to recoup these costs. I think the problem is more that we have these high drug development costs. But the point is, okay, sometimes it doesn't work in some areas, like for example, software and things like that, or they like stifling innovation. But then the institutions don't get changed, right?
Yeah.
So, and
And changing institutions usually takes a lot of time and effort, partially because institutions are full of people. And people are the most recalcitrant entities you can possibly get most of the time. Sometimes they're not, but most of the time, once you have a nice, cozy institution and you're having coffee with your coworkers and you have a way of doing it, if somebody introduces a change, why should you adopt it? It might actually upset that little social order. And indeed, you tend to just copy what others are doing. So even if the change makes sense, if you are the only one doing it, you're standing out, and so on and so on. You can go from the micro psychological level over to big institutional failings like the Parkinson's laws of bureaucracy. And the end result is that the institution tends to lag. And the bigger ones, the more highly regulated ones that have a kind of reinforcement rods of regulations going through them, become exceedingly slow moving. And this is, of course, a real nightmare if the underlying technologies change rapidly.
yeah, I'm tempted to jump ahead in the conversation talking about institutional adaptation. But first, I want to talk a bit more about the history of innovation and stagnation. So, are there kind of historical periods we can point at as like instructive examples for either acceleration and stagnation? And what are kind of the key things we can learn from them?
So typically people start talking about dark ages where nothing much was going on. And of course, that's wrong. People are still living their lives. The village smith is still making horseshoes and things like that. And actually, there is innovation going on. But quite often, when you have small scale societies, it's hard to spread your innovations. Innovation is relatively rare, and typically it takes people who are got enough resources to try out crazy stuff that might not work. If you're living on the margin, you're not going to do it. So it's worth noticing that humanity has been around for 100,000 years, and during that time, flint knapping technique improved, but it improved slowly. It literally took thousands of years for it to get better. And in many cases, you have small populations that have a hard time even retaining the more high-tech Neolithical technologies if they're isolated. You also have these moments when a lot of stuff happens. And quite often they happen because you have different groups of people meeting each other and exchanging ideas. Ideas are easy to copy. Trade is really effective. So when you see the Mediterranean, for example, a lot of things were going on there, both early on in the Bronze Age and even more in the Iron Age, as the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans moved people and ideas around. you saw a lot of innovation. And even when the Roman Empire fell, a lot of that innovation stayed. As long as you could still make it, as long as there was still a market for it, you did it. So we might have lost the secret of Roman concrete because there was not that interest in building big buildings anymore. Well, all the other technologies stayed around. I think what happens is also that sometimes you need a cluster of people coming up with ideas. Having that an environment where people are throwing ideas at each other, amplifying them, testing them out, and then implementing them. That's surprisingly rare. Again, we humans like to copy other humans rather than standing out. So, getting something like ancient Athens, where people are mostly throwing literal ideas at each other rather than building things, or the practicalities of Rome, or places like the Scottish Industrial Revolution, these are very rare clusters in time and space. So they're precious. And the problem is, of course, everybody wants to have a silicon something or other in the country. So there have been endless projects trying to open the Silicon Billabong in Australia or Silicon something or other. But Silicon Valley kind of remained Silicon Valley. Why? Well, most people who are really good at computers end up in Silicon Valley. And that cluster, having both the innovation, having the funding, having the networks and institutions, become extremely powerful. Even when it occasionally fails. In the late 1980s, Japanese semiconductors kind of wiped out Silicon Valley in some sense. But the people and institutions remained, and they just realized, okay, we shouldn't be doing computer memory chips. We should be doing microprocessors. They dusted themselves off, reinvented Silicon Valley, and did that. And now it's rather little silicon going on in the Silicon Valley. It's more software. And again, that cluster is still intact. The interesting thing here is, of course, there is a lot of features, and you can read endless business books about what these features are, but you can't easily get them. You can't just say that I want this for my town. When Silicon Roundabout around the old street showed up in London, all the local politicians were very surprised. They didn't expect to have a startup cluster there. And relatively wisely, they stayed away from it. So it actually thrived and developed and became something. In quite a lot of cases, of course, it's very easy to suffocate it because you're immediately rushing in and roping everybody into these big, bureaucratic, complicated projects that saps all the energy.
Yeah, yeah. I Is it fair to say that humans generally have a very strong bias against innovation, right? You say it's really rare, and also the innovator is often really at risk, right? So there's things like the Machiavelli effect, for example, that we often talked about on this podcast. Like as an innovator, there's a real risk to you, right? Because you're often changing the order of things, so you're facing fierce resistance.
Yeah. I think there is a fundamental problem in that upsetting the social order is really dangerous. If you're living in a hunter-gatherer tribe, you can literally die. You really want to get along with your friends and family, and if they are full of superstitious beliefs, yeah, you better follow them. Because if you don't, you're not one of us, and then you're not going to make it. So there is Joseph Heinrich wrote this interesting book, The Secret of Our Success, where he basically makes the argument that, yeah, the secret is that we copy other people. And a lot of the stuff we copy is nonsense. But some of it contains dearly bought insights on how to survive in a complex environment. There are those crazy people who occasionally try to eat that new fruit. And most of them get sick and quite a lot of them die. But occasionally we discover the cucumber. And that is great. But that cost is high. And the general rules about what you can and cannot eat, many of them are total nonsense rules. But actually checking which of them are correct or not is too expensive if you're living there on the margin. And this, of course, keeps on going as you build a more complex society. In Swedish society, we like consensus a lot, which means that innovators and entrepreneurs actually are problematic guys, because if somebody just invents something or does something different without checking in and getting a consensus with the group, they're upset with consensus, and that's not fair. That's not how you do it here. So there is maybe a reason why so many successful Swedes are not in Sweden, but go elsewhere. Of course, you can sometimes create your own environment. You can create your little bubbles. And these days, of course, if you go among the fintech startups and entrepreneur circles of Stockholm, you find bubbles that feel just like the Bay Area or a Silicon Roundabout, but they have very little in common with the towns outside Stockholm. So you can create something that works like that, but you still have an interface problem with the rest of society. And we've seen this, of course, when new technologies arrive, especially computer technology has to this day remained a problem because it's essential, it's powerful, it's useful. But so many parts of the institutions and decision making don't understand at all what it can and cannot do. And that the lack of understanding quite often comes back and bites everybody.
Mm-hmm. Kind of had just during this conversation kind of an idea and was wondering if you think about it, sort of to conceptualize what is the requirements for innovation, right? And if you kind of have a 2 by 2 matrix, one is you have the possibility of scaling, right? So you can't be an isolated society, right? So there's not much to gain to spread from there just because you can't copy, you don't have a big market to go into. But you also can't have a monoculture, right? Because during a monoculture, it would shun like the innovators. So you need to have like small, decentralized groups that can kind of be contrarian, right? So you need the small groups that can be their own petri dishes where they do things very different, but they need to have a society that it can scale into, right? So you can't have a monoculture, like Sweden or many other larger societies that are not that like tolerant of the innovator or not that like adaptive to these new things. You want to have a society where kind of the culture norms give the innovator kind of a predisposition of innocence until proven guilty or something like that. And you need a big market to scale into, right?
Yeah, you need a structure basically, and this shows up again and again. You could make a analogy, for example, with genetic programming. So in genetic programming, you start out with random programs to try to solve a problem. You run them, you evaluate how well they do it, and the best ones they multiply. The worst ones are removed. You add a bit of mutation recombination. Now, you can run this as a big petri dish, and that kind of works. But it turns out that it works even better if you split it into smaller petri dishes. They're sometimes called demes from a biological term based on the Greek municipality, where individuals can compete internally in that smaller village, but we can also move with some probability between them. And the reason this works is, of course, now you can test it out compared to other systems, and you can also maintain a higher diversity in total. Because in the big petri dish, everything gets mixed up. You have much less diversity. If there is one very successful thing, it has to sweep the whole population. Now diversity goes down, and there is less room for further evolution. And of course, you can make similar arguments in the kind of classical liberal sense of, yeah, you want to have a private space. You need to be able to form private associations where you can play around with ideas that the mainstream doesn't agree with. And if these ideas are really cool or really good, then they can get copied, which is, of course, what typically happens with subcultures. You come up with a cool subculture because you're quirky and weird people, and then people start copying it. And before you know it, the posers are taking it, and then it's suddenly a high status fashion item. And all the original people, of course, have moved on long ago to something else. Now, in the case of fashions, that doesn't matter very much. When it comes to software or technology, it's actually a really important thing that you can both innovate when it's not working very well. You generally have this problem that as an innovator, you have innovator's dilemma. You might have a disruptive innovation, but it's still going to be worse than the mainstream approach, which has been tried and tested, and literally the millions of engineer hours have been spent on perfecting it. So your little device needs a kind of safe space to explore, but it can't be too closed. because then, of course, you're going to keep on exploring that forever without ever getting particularly better. I think this is unfortunately true for a whole host of technologies, that they got their own little safe spaces that never have to work. Yeah, I think that was true for fusion up until very recently. It was an area where everybody agreed that this is the energy of the future, 50 years in the future at any point in time. But you could make entire careers at the big projects, but none of the big projects were very likely to actually go into business. That changed over the last 10, 15 years when actually fusion companies started showing up. And they're really upsetting also the traditional big fusion projects because they're poaching the postdocs. They're even trying to move fast and build stuff that actually could make money. That's very useful. We kind of cracked that little petri dish and open it to the wider world. And I think this balance between having safe nooks and crannies and the openness is important. And it also shows the need to decentralize, because you never know what actually works, both in terms of the size of the niches, but also what innovations actually might function.
Mhm. So you're in academia, and I'm wondering what you would say on the state of like the institution of science or scientific institutions today. What I often observe, or seems to me, especially when they're like large and have a lot of funding, is it almost like discourages innovation. Like in the area where I am in radical life extension, a lot of people argue, oh, we need like hundreds of millions or billions in funding. Um, which I agree in general, but then I always say, okay, but give it like to 10 or 20 different organizations or something like that, right? It seems to me that we have a lot of money for innovation, right? We're spending like billions on like fighting cancers or Alzheimer's or like climate change, like even trillions. But it seems to me that we're not making a lot of progress in these like very large, very centralized organizations.
Yeah. And part of that is, of course, that successful academic institutions are successful because they're able to replicate themselves into the future. Oxford University, which I love dearly, is older than the Aztec Empire. It outlasted many empires by now. And it's very good at what it's doing, which is mostly making sure Oxford keeps on going. Then there is this side thing, education and research. Now, that might have education might have been the starting reason, and then research became a part of it. And it certainly gets done a lot of excellent education research, but the institution has been optimized for that. And inside research, of course, if your research agenda fits with the funding bodies, if it has all the right hallmarks for the latest goal or fashion, great, you're getting lots of funding. You can hire a lot of postdocs, you get a lot of papers done, your career is going to go well, and you have PhD students who go out and try to have a career in that domain. This is great if that is an important domain and if you're actually producing something that matters. But again, the problem is, of course, that the measuring stick in academia, at least for academic careers, is quite often the just publishing papers in high prestige journals, doing high prestige stuff. Now, most academics will say, yeah, that's kind of true, but we also get prestige by actually discovering important things. Stephen Hawking did not just play the academic game very well. He actually discovered really interesting things. And that's true. Unfortunately, there is at least some link to reality, at least in some parts of academia. But I do think that the whole academic system quite often have biases. That means that you focus on a few domains. And that unfortunately also involves the funding bodies, which are, of course, manned by high prestige academics. Again, they're somewhat motivated by doing good science and helping humanity, but they also have to play it by that the game. A friend of mine, Olle Häggström, a professor of mathematical statistics here in Sweden, he was part of the Swedish Science Council, and he noticed that the rules say that we should giving money to really the best, excellent research. It doesn't say anything about that it's actually good for the world. So if somebody came up with a really good proposal that was excellent for a doomsday machine, we should be giving them funding. Yeah, that seems to be it. That's crazy. They all agreed around the table it was crazy. Only tried to change the rules, discovered that he couldn't, because the institutional setting, the rules set by the government are all formulated in such a way that getting that good for the world part in is a major political undertaking. So here is an example where I think the institutions do really great job in some regards, but fail at other. Now, I'm very happy that there are competition to traditional academia, not just from business, but that we're getting things like the focused research organizations, we're getting independent think tanks, we're getting more and more interesting alternatives. Indeed, so many alternatives that I can't keep abreast of all of them, which makes me very happy and also very confused.
Mm-hmm. I don't have a complete thought, but what makes organizations like Oxford or like the church or the state, like there's survivorship bias, right? We have them because they survived. And why did they survive is because they optimized for stability and durability, right? So that means they have to resist innovation a lot, right? But also sometimes they have to adapt to innovation.
Oh, yeah. It's worth recognizing that universities seem to have a much higher birth date than the death rate. The number of universities in the world has increased. There are some defunct universities, but a surprisingly short list. It's a bit like cities. Cities don't seem to age, they actually just keep on going. It's relatively rare when a city dies. It usually happens mostly to small villages, but bigger cities are just keeping on going. Jericho is probably older than 10,000 years, according to the latest archaeology. So you quickly get those maintenance things going. But cities, of course, are not all about just perpetuating themselves into the future. People actually use cities to live in. Cities have a lot of reasons to exist, and the same goes for universities. It's when an organization is only about maintaining itself when it's really pathological. When you get that bureaucracy where the most important thing is to pay the salary of the bureaucrats and really prevent any change in that. That's where it's just parasitic. In practice, you reach some kind of balance. And quite often, of course, if you want to maximize the good for humanity or do research, you're going to complain that so much is going to that other stuff. But ideally, you want to have a diversity between the institutions. Having time limited institutions, I think, is really valuable. But there is also value in having institutions that maintain a memory over very long spans of time. We did a little project here at the Institute for Future Studies about nuclear epistemology. How do you retain the knowledge about where you buried the nuclear waste far into the future? And people have been proposing all sorts of interesting and evocative things for that. But the most reasonable thing is actually having redundant copies in a lot of libraries and people who just maintain the memory. You want a stable institution, and that's probably embedded in another stable institution. So we realized that given that after about 500 years, most nuclear waste is actually not terribly dangerous, that means that you actually just need to have a 500-year time scale, which is bigger than most organizations try to build on, but it's way more doable than trying to communicate with somebody 100,000 years into the future. So recognizing what time dimensions you want to have is also valuable. When you start your company, you should probably think about beyond what point in time does this company not make sense, whether it should probably have be folded up or something like that. And sometimes, of course, that can be long. Sometimes it's conditional. If this other technology shows up, then we shouldn't be doing this. Most companies, of course, never do that. They just keep on chugging along up until they get destroyed by a new technology or that the market changes. And they are very surprised that that happened.
Mm.
So to do a little tangent here, so when the Future of Humanity Institute was closed, I realized that we actually didn't have any planned routines for folding up an institute. Indeed, that's not standard. But it probably should be whenever you make a project, an institution, you should already from the start think about how do I archive this? How do I make sure that the proper products get put into the archive so they keep on going? How do I make sure that the memory of the relevant stuff keeps on going? And this is a good design tool for anything. It's a bit
Yeah,
like designing objects for recycling.
yeah. I like that idea that you need to design the institution. I mean, around like the purpose. What do you want to be out in the world? Does it need to outlast, or how long does it need to last? Like these are all important design factors. Um, I'd like to talk about the governance of risk, of course, right? So, um, there are these two competing or things that are both true at the same time, right? On the one hand, the biggest risk is not taking risk, especially in a world that's like very adaptive and constantly changing. On the other hand, any organization to survive or to continue needs to reduce risk over time, right? So how do we think about like the governance of risk, and especially as we go through like different scales, right? There's
Mm.
organizational risk, and there's risk to like a society, and there's like global risk.
Yeah, and risk and uncertainty are quite closely tied in, because from the opposite side there is opportunity. You need to take opportunities. Of course, some institutions maybe shouldn't take opportunities, should just keep on doing the same, but it's probably a good idea to do good things if you have a chance. And in computer science, we have the exploration versus exploitation dilemma. If you have a robot learning an environment, it needs to explore it, but it also needs to do whatever it's intended to. So spending all the time on exploration makes it pretty useless. So typically, when you don't know anything, you should do much more exploration. And as you know more and more and it becomes more stable, you do more exploitation. You do the things that have value. And I think the same thing goes with risk. To some extent, you want to take a fair bit of risk from the start, because you might learn a lot of valuable information and then you can estimate the risk. But this, of course, depends on the risk profile. So there's some environments that are very forgiving. So you can imagine a little robot trundling along and occasionally bumping into a wall. That's not terribly bad. It might scuff a wall and its own cover, but it's not messing things up. There might be other environments like the daycare center where it's rather important that it not run into the kids. At that point, the drawback of taking a risk gets much bigger, and you want to get that knowledge in probably already from the start. You want to design that understanding. And there are some situations when we're dealing with global catastrophic risks where you never ever want to go into certain areas or that might be too dangerous. So, learning about the probability distribution of risks and how big the losses are is really valuable. And I think quite a lot of organizations are not doing that, because we're not actually trying to learn very much. Instead, you tell a good story. You develop a risk standard. Quite a lot of them then develop ever more elaborate risk assessment techniques involving spreadsheets and nice color coding, and you have a risk assessment of all kinds. I've been in meetings like that, and it makes you feel very safe and smug. We have thought about everything. But I remember my pessimistic father telling me, Anders, always have a plan B, because plan A will always fail. And you need a plan C because plan B will fail. And a plan D, E, and F. But when you get to plan F, you actually don't need to keep on going, because at this point you will have to improvise. But you know a fair bit about the domain, because now it's not just that you have thought about what could go wrong, but also ways of handling it and being flexible about it. So that is, of course, the important part. It's not just avoiding the risk, it's how do you respond to it? And that depends a bit on the styles of risk. Now, when you have an organization, quite often you can't avoid certain risks from happening. Bad luck happens to everybody. I did a book chapter where I did some statistical survivorship analysis of kingdoms, of the empires, civilizations, and it looks actually like generally they have a constant hazard rate per unit time. That is, the risk of crashing is constant regardless of how old you are. There is a bit for companies. This is also true, with the exception of startups that have a bit of infant mortality, and a small tail of exceedingly long-lived companies that are typically Japanese hot springs. Basically, they are the exceptions. Generally, it's bad luck that gets you. And the real question is, how do I save myself from bad luck? Well, I might be agile and adaptive, but sooner or later, the CEO runs off with the money or something else happens. One approach, going back actually to the discussion we had about deems and innovation when you have smaller subpopulations, is that you can have a meta population. So instead of treating it as the organization as one big lump, split it into parts. And if one part crashes, the other ones can go in and rebuild it. This is called a metapopulation in ecology. You might have butterflies living in meadows and occasionally moving between meadows through the forest. They do that relatively rarely, but it means that if the butterflies go extinct there, it can get resettled. And the total probability of entire population, as long as everything else is fine, surviving for a long time, goes up tremendously. By having backup copies, you can actually survive indefinitely. Indeed, if a number of backup copies of your system grows with the logarithm of time, you, at least on paper, you can have a finite probability of surviving to infinitely far in the future.
Yeah.
In practice, sooner or later, you're going to have that bad luck thing that affects every single part of the system. And so at that point, you still have a limiting factor.
Mm-hmm. And to reframe a bit, one of the aspects that you were talking about is the idea of closed systems versus open systems, right? So, and I think that's also kind of where there's a broad tendency, I think, to think of closed systems as kind of better sort of designed for mitigating risk. And that comes kind of from the idea that if you have like a dangerous technology, say like nuclear weapons or whatever, you don't want to have like a nuclear bomb in like the hands of everyone who can like build it in like their little basement, right? So fewer people that have the ability to use a dangerous technology means lower risk. Right? I think that's kind of where that intuition comes from, to say, we should have a small group of people, like a government or like an intergovernmental consensus internationally, like govern some of these risks coming from. But that kind of clashes with the idea, when you have a closed system, you also don't have the ability to develop more safeguards, right, by loads of people that are involved, right? So Mark Andreessen often
Yeah,
talks
I
about,
heard from
yeah,
some greybeards at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories that many of their top secret projects were rather bad because so few people could criticize them. The less secret projects had plenty of people pointing out why the cork bomb would never fly or whatever it was. And I think there is a lot of truth to that. Closed systems, yes, you can keep the information on the inside, you can keep the control on the inside, maybe. And that works if the loss of the information might be just too dreadful. If there was a simple way of blowing up the world, you don't want that to be public knowledge. You don't want that to be published on the internet, because then the world will not last 5 minutes. But there are other risks where you can't do this because the risk already is out there. Computer viruses, anybody can write them. It's not terribly hard. There are examples, there are open source versions, there is theory about it. Everybody has more or less access to a compiler, etc. So there, in order to defend against computer viruses, you need antivirus software. You need to have safeguards protecting various systems in practical ways. So understanding the style of risk is very important for understanding whether you can fix it by keeping it closed or trying to be open about it. When it comes to a pandemic, it's really important to tell everybody that, it looks like this virus is spreading right now. Could please everybody help us figure out what's going on here and do something about it? Which is why the early unwillingness in Wuhan from the authority side of admitting that there was anything bad going on actually messed up the COVID the pandemic, because they delayed. They made it harder to get that information out. Once it was out, people globally very quickly sequenced the virus. DeepMind developed protein models in 3D and put them online. People started working on vaccines very quickly. At least the science part worked amazingly well when you could spread it around. Now, in this case, of course, it's also not terribly dangerous knowing the sequence of a COVID virus. Because, in theory, a bioterrorist could make their own COVID virus. But it's kind of a meh as a bioweapon. Yeah, the pandemic was by no means a fun thing, and it caused enormous harm to a lot of people. But it's not really the thing that I stay awake at night over. Many of those viruses are unproblematic. There are other biological innovations that I wouldn't want to talk about because I don't want to give other people ideas. But the problem here is, if I can come up with this evil idea, how likely is it that other people who are better at being evil or better at biotechnology than me could come up with it? probably a fairly high one. So I should probably talk to somebody about setting up safeguards, or we should make preventative measures that have to be distributed because the threat might come from anywhere.
Yeah, it seems to me we have a problem with a preponderance mostly of closed systems for dealing with risk, right? So in many ways, that kind of triggered me to do what I do now, right? Sort of build a more open approach to governance, or like a more decentralized way of doing governance. Like for example, that like the response to a global pandemic was centralized in like a CDC or an FDA, right? So when it comes to like the vaccine or whatever, these are all things that I think prevent sort of decentralized adaptation to something, like by sort of using a closed system approach um, to sort of an emerging challenge. But then on the other hand, the difficulty is if there are such things as, okay, like nuclear weapon, you don't want everyone to have it, you want to close the information off, then these kind of institutions seem to always outgrow their original purpose and also take over other things and other risks
Yep.
where they actually do the
Yeah.
opposite and make things more risky.
Yeah. So in the case of nuclear weapons, the problem is not the secret. The atomic secret kind of leaked almost instantly in the 1940s.
Yeah, it's actually enriching
Besides the Soviet spies, clever people very quickly figured out what was going on at Los Alamos once the bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It turns out that nuclear weapons are controllable because you need very special equipment to get those isotopes pure, and that is probably what has saved us. Now, when it comes to other forms of things like certain pathogens, that's where you might try to control the information, but it's more problematic. I think you have interesting issues about the complex landscape, for example, about AI, where foundation models seem to require enormous data and enormous compute to train. That means that we're a little bit like the nuclear weapons. You can kind of figure out who's doing it because that big data centers are hard to hide. But we might get an algorithmic improvement tomorrow when some clever guy realizes I can make an exponentially better training by using this one simple trick. And suddenly the data centers are going to stand there totally empty as people are training the ChatGPT 7 on their laptops. Maybe. We can't predict whether that is going to happen, but we can kind of try to figure out ways of managing some of these aspects. The problem you pointed out is that when you build an institution around a certain assumption of how the risk works, that can quite often get really obsolete. So in the 1940s, people were literally thinking about coming up with all sorts of crazy ways. Well, not necessarily crazy, but to our current eyes, very weird ideas on how do you manage nuclear weapons. Maybe the United Nations should be running it, as the Baruch plan said. That failed because the Soviet Union didn't think the Americans were serious about it. And maybe they weren't, but there was at least some people on the American side that actually seriously believed it. There was other people saying, no, we should actually just go straight and nuke Moscow now. And a whole host of other ideas about how to manage it. To some extent, 10 years later, people had invented game theory and developed MID, and we got institutions, and we ended up with an institution that in some sense served the world by just risking an existential disaster, but at least it kind of created kind of stability. The problem with that one is it falls apart if you start having irrational actors or too many actors. And I think we're rapidly approaching that world right now. So we're going to need something completely different to deal with that.
Yeah.
And often, of course, you don't even understand what you're trying to regulate. My great fear about the European Union in trying to regulate AI risk is that it creates this elaborate legal system that on paper is really, really good, but nobody bothered to ask any programmers whether you can implement it. So you might end up with complicated rules that mean that only big companies that can follow the complicated rules can do business with AI in the EU, and everybody else does it somewhere else. And the EU, for some weird reason, is not competitive in AI. Now, in some cases, that might be good. I take AI risk rather seriously. So maybe slowing down AI with bureaucracy is exactly what we need. But quite likely you end up with institutions that outstay their usefulness. Sometimes we can adapt. It's actually surprising how often ancient institutions do adapt. Britain, as an example, gets invaded every 2 or 3 centuries by somebody, and usually we put in a new kind of government on top of the other stuff, but you keep all the old stuff. And that's, of course, how Britain just works. So the end result is you have this layering of in ancient Celtic stuff and Norse stuff and the Saxons. And then, of course, the Normans coming in and the Romans somewhere in between. And that layer cake is in some sense actually fairly robust. It's also tremendously messy and bureaucratic and not always adaptive.
Yeah. Um, so we talked a lot about the governance of innovation, and I deliberately used that phrasing, governance of innovation, like how do we deal with new things? And then also the innovation of governance, like, how do we, what are the kind of structures and institutions that we use to govern risk and innovation, whatever. And so you have a new book you're writing on. Can you give us a bit of a peek into what it's about? Because it sounds to me from the title that it is about governance innovation.
Yeah, so the current title is Law, Liberty and Leviathan, Human Autonomy in an Era of Existential Risk and Artificial Intelligence. And this began when my co-author, the Cyril Holm, and me, he's a professor of jurisprudence, we started talking during lockdown, actually, about things like how can governments respond to big disasters? How do we handle it well? What about Nick Bostrom's idea about a singleton, that maybe to deal with the biggest existential risk, we need a single agency on top of the world that can kind of make sure that the certain decisions stick? Because in a world where it's very easy to cause existential risk, you can't really have a current semi-anarchic order between nations. But Cyril, being a professor of law, of course, also was thinking about questions like, what is legal science about? What is law? And one explanation that we expound in the first third of the book is that, well, legal systems and legal orders, they are really a way for us to solve hard coordination problems as people. We need to interact with other people. We need to do this well. Many of these coordination problems are very computationally hard to solve. There is incentives for us to cheat and misbehave. So we create systems that make it easier not to do that. And in some cases, it's just setting incentives. If I don't obey the rules, the police will get me. But quite often, it's also ways of creating elaborate solutions. We have contract law, which rarely ends up in jail, but the threat of going to court or arbitration if we disagree about a contract makes us behave in a different way. And we can embed a lot of normative ideas about what we should be doing in this system. So what we end up with is a form of extended cognitive system. Just like I can extend my cognition by having some part of my knowledge existing on my smartphone and in notebooks, we have a joint extended cognitive system existing between our brains and on lots of pieces of paper, and these norms that exist in society that we can enforce. And when this works well, then you get a lot of peace and prosperity out of it. And power to some people who are good at playing the game, of course. That is also almost a virtue of a system, because a lot of the some more or less sociopathic people who like power, they are going to do their utmost to learn the system and get really good at making sure that it works. And yep, they might be cheating from time to time, but once they cheated their way to the top, they're going to be a stickler for making sure everybody else follows the system. So the end result is that we get this emergent order. So this is nothing new. This is very much what Herbert Simon and Friedrich von Hayek and others talked about, that generates peace and prosperity and is powered by human autonomous actions. After all, it's very little that the law is forcing me to do or not do. It's just that I got this little voice in my head of, that's illegal, oh, that's immoral, that's fattening. So all these internal normative signals make me behave. And by coordinating us, we get these big systems that work really well. So that's the old world. But now we're getting a world where artificial intelligence shows up. And these systems, we call them guides because they're globally unique, something, I forgot what the abbreviation is for. They're hard to design. As centrally planned economies demonstrated, actually, the computational task of allocating goods is just too big, even in a simple economy. So that experiment came crashing down, besides all the other moral and political problems of centrally planned economies. But with software, we can automate parts of a system. We can gradually take this extended cognitive system and replace it with software or add software into it to make it work even better. So I came from a seminar earlier today that was organized by the Swedish labor movement and the Social Democratic Party, which was about the welfare state in the age of AI. And a lot of it was about algorithmic governance, because it's, of course, already creeping in many companies where you're using monitoring systems to keep track of what the employees are doing. It's not just keeping track of the stocks in the storeroom. Now you're keeping track of how the employees are moving the stock and optimizing that, which is not always a very fun thing to be subject to, of course. We humans chafe when our autonomy is limited like that. But we can also see uses of it in governance. In many cases, decisions should be left to software because they can be made 24/7 and they're kind of dead obvious that you should just have these permissions. And this can be used to actually make things more accountable. You can have systems where if a computer makes a decision that is not in my favor, I can always contact a human to check it, etc. But the logic seems to be that we're going to add more and more AI. I'm writing a thing that I'm sending off to Brussels to the European Union right now, and I'm having ChatGPT rewrite my thoughts into proper bureaucraties. And I bet that somewhere over in Brussels, somebody is going to have my email go through ChatGPT. Can somebody explain what this Anders guy is actually saying? Maybe it's not happening right now. Maybe we're still fluent in bureaucraties in Brussels in 2024. But by next year, I think more and more is going to be pieces of software talking to each other, because that's what's happening in a lot of other regulatory systems. So in the end, we might end up with an AI takeover of our governance. And this might actually be mostly a good thing if we handle it well. Yes, we need to solve the AI alignment problem. We also kind of need to make sure that the government is aligned with us. And that's a much tougher thing, because many governments have proven that they're extremely dangerous artificial intelligence because they can kill us. They have police, they have soldiers, they have tax collectors. These are dangerous things, and the states should be treated as extremely dangerous tools. We should not forget that they are artificial intelligences too, in some extent. But we end up in a perhaps ideal situation where we have really good AI, that, okay, we get a lot of peace and prosperity out of this system because now it coordinates everything really beautifully. But there is no need for human autonomous action anymore. And that suddenly feels weird. So Surami called it the serfdom conclusion. But in this world, maybe to get the good things in life, you should give up on your autonomy. And many people say that's wrong. We should not do it. Still, I did a Twitter poll, and about 75% of people said that they would be happy to give up their autonomy if they had aligned AI, given the lifestyle of a pampered aristocrat. So maybe I'm just one of those 25% who still insist on doing everything myself. But deep down, many of us want to be in control of our lives. We want to feel in charge. And partially that is just because if we didn't, others would take advantage of us. We might have a long evolutionary past giving us this feeling. And maybe it's just a feeling, and maybe nice AI could actually totally do everything well, and we ought to be letting it do it. But I do think that that feeling is still a good enough reason to say we want to maintain autonomy. We don't want to be dominated by systems that we fear can go out of hand. Even if there is a mathematical proof that this is an aligned AI reliable, it's still not enough. Now, the really interesting final part of the book is, of course, well, can we do something about it? So we sketch various solutions. We think that you can start working on the second order alignment problem of actually taking aligned AI and people and creating societies that are aligned for human autonomy. Because we want autonomy in our own lives, but we might not want to have autonomy to start nuclear wars. We don't want autonomy about existential risk. We just want zero existential risk. You might want very tight coordination on the global level, but that's a level we as individual humans don't care anything at all about, really. We only care about the fruits of not getting nuked. So our argument is that we might actually want to use AI to create new forms of coordination And especially on the higher levels, they're optional for deciding what to eat tomorrow. If your AI advisor gives you a good piece of advice, you can take it or not. You should never be forced to follow that or enticed to follow it. If you can coordinate your company using AI services, well, might depend on how important it is for the world. I do think that once you get to the kind of things that can break the world, that's where we really want to actually create a cyborg system that's very powerful. The coolest part about this might be that this is the final thing that makes humanity autonomous. So in philosophy, there is this question: can a group have virtue? Can it be an autonomous agent? And typically, you need to have reasons going on inside the group that if they were going on inside an individual human, we would say, yeah, these are grounded in what kind of guy that person is. He's making an autonomous decision. And if we had the right internal structures for a group, maybe this could apply. I don't think that applies to humanity right now. But it might very well be that a sufficiently coordinated humanity might become an autonomous group agent that actually can take accountability for its future. The interesting part is that doesn't mean that there has to be this single big AI in the cloud running everything. It might very well be a distributed system. We just haven't architected it yet.
Curious. So you're kind of saying or implying, or what could be a possibility in a positive future, is that that AIs could limit the risk of Leviathan, right? Sort of
Yeah.
by outsourcing some
So
of its this.
So Thomas Hobbes came up with Leviathan back in the 1600s when he saw war and pestilence going across England. He was very much writing from the perspective of the British Civil War. And then he said, okay, we can't really have everybody's war against everybody else. We need coordination. And he imagined that the best form of coordination is just to agree that the sovereign gets to run everything. And even if he's cruel and ruthless, it's still so much better than civil war. Even the worst king is better than a civil war. Now, if he got teleported to London today, he would probably look at the Houses of Parliament and conclude, yeah, okay, you're not running it with the sovereign like I thought, but this seems to be doing exactly the same job and it works pretty well. Let's hide the previous 10 years of British politics because that would not have impressed him very much. The interesting part here is, of course, that Leviathan, when you think about the state as this collective machine, is a dangerous tool. And adding AI to it doesn't necessarily make it less dangerous. It's just that now you have a cyborg Leviathan. You still need that alignment. And it's not just an alignment of the AI part, it's the alignment of the whole system. And I think this is a profound question. How do you actually create alignment, not just of software with human interests and survival, but alignment of markets, alignment of organization, alignment of states? And I think it is a shared problem. We have complex adaptive systems. They're observing the world, they're taking somewhat autonomous or autonomous-like actions, and they have internal goals, some of them emergent, and some of them very pathological. Can we construct systems that keep them on the straight and narrow?
Yeah, I have so many more questions about this topic, but unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time. Um,
Well, this is a start.
yeah,
The
yeah,
book, in many ways, is the result of Cyril and me writing this paper during lockdown, trying to make it a good paper, realizing it doesn't work. Let's dilute it into a book. We hoped that that would also naturally mean that we now have this elegant solution at the end. We end up with kind of three possible divergent solutions, and basically more research is needed. But we're over hopeful. We think that second order alignment is something you can research, and I think we can innovate. And this is where decentralized governance, this is where coordination mechanisms, whether that is blockchain or markets or just norms that we copy by watching other people around us, we can learn the science and art of weaving them together into human affiliated worlds.
yeah, yeah. And I'm really looking forward to hopefully continuing this conversation next year in the next Vitalia pop-up city. So maybe as a final question, right? So we met here in Vitalia, where we're building a district that's focused on life extension within Próspera, which is itself a huge like governance innovation experiment. What were your impressions from your last trips, or like hopes or advice on sort of make progress on the arc of innovation and governance?
So when I visited Vitalia and Próspera, the main thing I noticed was I couldn't see Próspera, which makes sense, of course, because you don't really notice quite a lot of institutions around you. Sometimes they get big marble palaces and become very, very visible. But many of the most important institutions are extremely virtual. Próspera for me was mostly a lot of QR codes put up on bulletin boards all over the place for doing various things. And I think it's super valuable to try out these things. We need to try various charter cities. We both need to see where they fail and where they succeed. We need pop up cities because getting back to that exploration versus exploitation dilemma, right now we haven't done that much exploration. Certainly, there have been states and organizations going on for thousands of years, but in many cases, they haven't had the chance to do much exploration. You don't try a lot of lightweight experiments and see what works. Sometimes you come across a good idea, and then it gets eventually incorporated in the toolbox when you build a new government. We have ideas on how to run committees and elections. There are ways of writing constitutions that work better than others. We understand some failure modes of government and can handle that. But very obvious that it's many more that are possible, especially since societies are information limited. So without widespread literacy, you can't really implement parliamentary democracy. Even if you convinced the ancient Egyptians that this was a great idea, you couldn't actually run it because you can't run political parties if people can't read the party manifestos of the papyrus with the hieroglyphs because you don't have enough scribes. Once you have a printing press, you can start teaching people to read and write, and you can start having votes. But it still took a few centuries to get a modern parliamentary democracy because many of the innovations took time and needed testing out. And we have raised that ceiling yet again, thanks to internet, blockchain, encryption, AI, etc. We still haven't explored this space, and we need way more exploration. And we probably need to speed it up a lot. My biggest concern is, of course, the mean time between failure in governance can be somewhat long because it happens on kind of human timescales, institutional timescales, which can be years, which is a problem because we don't want to wait years to see that, we finally found what crashed this organization. So you might want many copies so you can learn from them.
Yeah. Anders, this was a really wonderful conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Looking forward to see you again in January and February next year in the Vitalia pop-up city.
Yeah, it's going to be wonderful.
Yeah.
Especially as a Swede sitting here in the darkness of winter, I realize I need to get closer to the equator.
Yeah, it's good.
But also closer to experiments in innovation.
Exactly. And for any of our listeners who are thinking of joining us, you can sign up. It's going to be a lot of fun. Anders, anything else that you would like to draw our listeners' attention to about your work, or how to contact you, or what you're currently working on before we part ways?
Well, I'm working on everything. I'm trying to finish up this book so I can work on my Grand Futures book. Mm-hmm. And then there is the brain emulation stuff. And then there is dozens of papers about other things. So if anybody out there know how to clone me, please contact me. That's what I really need.
Maybe that's the actual one technology, while the others are stagnating, cloning Anders. Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on, Anders.
Thank you. Cheers.